Welcome back to those of you who've been here before, and welcome if anybody, I think there's a few new faces. This is Trinity's Space for Civic Engagement and Getting to Know Our Neighbours. My name is Mary Coakley and I look after the space. And this is the third of a 4-week series. So do join us next Wednesday for the last Wednesday of this series. And as has been tradition, we'll finish with a few nibbles and drinks. Sorry, Micheál, you missed out on that.
No, you weren't telling me that now. You never said anything about nibbles and stuff afterwards. All right, go on.
You're very welcome to come back. And, you know, we'll be back again in September, hopefully. If you have any feedback, suggestions for speakers, what the topics you'd like to hear more about or less about, hopefully not less, do come back to us. So, thank you very much to Professor Micheál Ó Siochrú for coming along today. He is a very busy man. In fact, he is going off to do another talk in Malahide later this evening. In demand, exactly. And as well as his normal research, lecturing, etc., he's also head of the school, which is a hugely involved job. He is professor in modern history at Trinity, and his research focuses on 17th century Irish political, constitutional and military history, from the Ulster Plantation to the Jacobite Wars. That seems like a long period of time. He's published extensively, including the book God's Executioner, Oliver Cromwell and the Conquest of Ireland. So remember to go out and buy that if
loads of copies. Loads
of copies. So look forward to plenty of questions at the end, and he does have a train to catch, so we won't delay too much. But thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks a million. Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? I'm told I've got a very loud voice, and my family tell me all the time anyway. So, but if you're having any trouble, just throw your hand up and let me know. And first of all, I'd like to thank Mary and the team here for inviting me along this afternoon, because I love an opportunity to come out and to talk about this particular topic, which is one that's really sort of fascinated me for very many years, and probably one of the most recognisable characters, if you like, from the Irish past. Oliver Cromwell is just one of those names that really resonates with people, and even if they don't know particularly much about history, they kind of know something, or they feel they know something about Oliver Cromwell. When I was growing up as a young fellow, we used to spend a lot of time down in Kerry, where my dad was from. And we'd be driving around Kerry and we'd see a tumble-down castle or a broken wall or a deserted house, and I'd say to Dad, like, who did that? And he's going, that was Cromwell. And I was going, Jesus. And everywhere you went, well, that was Cromwell. And I was going, who the hell is Cromwell? He seems to have done an awful lot. So, you know, from a very early stage in my life, I was kind of always sort of curious about this man and, you know, what he did and why he has the reputation in Ireland that he still kind of does today. But I think what first really got me interested in it was many years later, when I was living in England and realising that over there they had a very different attitude and opinion towards Oliver Cromwell. It was much more sort of nuanced. It was, you know, some for, some against, etc. And I found this kind of interesting. And I was particularly fascinated. This, by the way, is the most reliable portrait we have of the man. If you can see here, painted as he was very famously known, warts and all. They didn't want any ornamentation, he didn't want any soft focus. He wanted to be shown as he was, a man of the people, you know, a fearsome reputation, and you can see something of that in his portrait there. But I remember hearing a story that's to do with our former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and when Bertie had been elected as Taoiseach, and around the same time you had Tony Blair had been elected as Prime Minister of Britain, and Bertie Ahern went over for a state visit to meet the new government, and he was meeting with Robin Cook, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs, if you like, in the British government. And Cook was waiting for him, and Bertie Ahern walked into this magnificent palatial office in the Foreign Office in London, looked around and walked straight back out again, okay, causing consternation. And all the officials, the British officials, didn't know what was going on, so we went running after the Taoiseach to say, what's going on? Why have you just walked out? And he said, I'm not going back into that room until you take down the portrait of that murderous bastard, okay? Now, the problem was the room was full of portraits of kings and princes and prime ministers, so they weren't sure which murderous bastard he was talking about. until he made it clear that he was actually referring to Oliver Cromwell. Now, I remember reading this story. It was reported widely in the British press at the time. I was sort of thinking, really? That sounds a little bit staged. But I remember talking to Bertie Ahern years afterwards, and he said, no, that was true. He wasn't quite as keen to sort of own up to the choice language, but I heard from another source that was exactly what was said. But it shows how, even at the very highest levels, right up to the present day, that Cromwell still evokes very, very strong emotions among people. And they've got very strong feelings about him and about particularly what he did here in Ireland, okay? Now, as I said, if you go to England, you'll see all around England, you've got Cromwell Square, Cromwell Road, Cromwell Drive. He's sort of places named after him all over the place. In fact, he's got more places named after him than anybody else in British history, with one exception. Who's that? Victoria, yeah, so you've got much more Victorias and etc. But bar Victoria, Cromwell is one of the most recognisable and named people. And in fact, at the time, the BBC, around the same time as this incident was taking place, held a poll about the most famous Britons of all time, and Cromwell came in the top 5. So, even well 350 years after his death, he's still there and still very much and very prominent. Now, if you go to the House of Parliament at Westminster, okay, you'll see the statue there to Oliver Cromwell. Okay, it's a very famous statue, and he's standing there, very typical. Okay, he's got a sword in one hand, and in the other hand he's got what? The Bible. Okay, and this is, he's God's warrior. These are the two big symbols of Cromwell: the sword, the military man, and on the other side, the sort of religious man, the man of God. And as I said, this statue stands outside the House of Parliament. Now, it's a very odd place for Cromwell to be placed, okay, because he effectively, for most of his later career, operated as a military dictator. He shut down Parliament. He didn't like Parliament, particularly when it didn't do what he had hoped. And so you really couldn't describe him as a parliamentarian, okay? And yet, there he is, and his statue, which was there from the 300th anniversary of his birth in 1599. So in 1899, this statue went up. Okay. In fact, they knew there was going to be so much controversy about this. It went up at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning in November, okay, because they were afraid, had they been much more open and public about it, that there would be protests, okay. But up it went, okay, and it still stands there to this day. There's only 2 other statues on the grounds of the Parliament at Westminster, okay, in addition to Cromwell. Anybody, any idea what the other 2 statues are? Churchill's across the road, but he's not on the grounds of Parliament. Any ideas? It's actually a very strange collection of individuals. Okay, he's got Cromwell, and then the other 2 are King Richard the Lionheart, and then bizarrely, just recently, Nelson Mandela. Okay, so they are the only 3 statues that you have on the grounds of the Parliament in Westminster. It's very strange, as I say, because Richard the Lionheart was actually French. Okay, he didn't speak English. He hated England. Okay, he spent less than a year of his time on the throne in England. He was most of the time off in what they call the Holy Land, on crusade, slaughtering anybody he could come across. A very truculent, strange individual, and again, quite a strange figure to have outside the sort of Parliament, the representative body. And then, as I said, the 3rd person of this collection is South African, Nelson Mandela, obviously from a more recent vintage. Okay, so those are the 3 that we have ended up with, but Cromwell is there. Okay, so the reason I'm sort of really interested in all this is how can somebody on one side of the Irish Sea be kind of revered and recognised in this way, and on the other side be reviled and seen as this absolutely appalling figure guilty of the most terrible crimes. So is this just simply a case of, English and Irish sort of misconceptions, misunderstandings, lack of empathy, lack of any kind of real genuine knowledge of the other, and we're just looking at a classic case of this? Well, I think it's a little bit more than that. Okay, and to begin with, if we go to Cromwell himself, okay, Cromwell is a fascinating character. Okay, I'm not saying he's a nice character, I'm not saying he's a good character, but he's a fascinating man. Okay, because his rise to prominence is absolutely extraordinary. Extraordinary. He was living in the 17th century, and the 17th century was a time of no social mobility. If you were born into the peasant class, you were a peasant. If you were born into the landowning class, you were a landowner. If you were the nobility or the elite, that's where you were. There was very little, if any, movement. Okay? And Cromwell was not born into a prominent family by any stretch of the imagination. Okay? He was actually a minor landowner from Cambridge. Okay? A small farmer. They would have been landowners, they would have had a little bit of land, but very, very little. Okay? And you would have expected such a man to live out his life in relative obscurity, nothing particularly prominent or noticeable in it, and that would be it. But that's not what happened. So how did this man, from relatively, no, he wasn't a peasant, he wasn't from the very lowest element of society, but he was a small farming class. Nothing particularly notable or extraordinary about him. So how did this man end up in such an extraordinary position of prominence and leaving such a legacy that we're still talking about him 350 years after his death? Well, there's two reasons for this. Two reasons that catapulted Cromwell into such an eminent position. And the first is that as a farmer, he was useless, okay? He was utterly rubbish. He inherited the land and made a complete mess of the farm, okay? Within a few years, he was effectively bankrupt, okay? The farm was failing. He had no money. He had a large family at this stage, and yet no income or no way of maintaining them. And things had got so bad that by the 1630s, when he was now in his mid-30s, and in that age, 17th century, mid-30s was, you know, a fair age. The life expectancy was much shorter than today, and he was in serious trouble. Okay, so much so that he actually made plans to emigrate to America. He was going to head off to the New World in an attempt to start again, to start afresh, to try and make something of his life because it looked like it was over as far as he was concerned in England. Okay, that's one of the great ifs. What if Cromwell had gone to America? And people say, oh, it would have been amazing, he would have done all. No, he wouldn't. He probably would have died within a year of getting there. It was harsh in those colonies in that time. People didn't live for very long. You know, he probably would have sailed off into obscurity, never to be heard of again. But before he left, he had what we would effectively now call today a breakdown. Okay, he had just basically, he could no longer cope. Okay, and it got all too much for him, and basically he just collapsed. And he spent about 3 months hidden away in his room at home, non-communicative, just simply wasn't able to manage, wasn't able to cope with anything, and it really looked as if, you know, in terms of his life and his hopes for the future, etc., it was all over. But what happened to him during this breakdown was something that we experience or hear about a lot in this time, which was a rebirth. That he was kind of reborn, and the rebirth was based on a discovery of a direct link now with God. Okay, that he now managed to communicate directly with God. Okay, there was no need for church, there was no need for priests and bishops and all that. He was able, through prayer, to communicate directly with God, and God now was directing Cromwell. So he now gave this man purpose, he gave him direction, he gave him energy. And so he emerges from this terrible period, this absolute low point of his life. This new man emerges, an energetic, driven, committed individual who believes very genuinely that he is now God's agent on earth. Okay, and he is basically doing God's will. And so very suddenly, from a position of obscurity, he begins to emerge into the public light. And he begins to take a number of positions in the local area. He begins to take on a number of administrative duties. And by 1640, he's been elected a member of Parliament for Cambridge. Okay, so quite a significant turnaround in a relatively short period of time from seemingly, you know, really there was no coming back from it. He absolutely manages to turn his life around. Now, if that's all he'd have done, again, he might have been a footnote in a few different histories. We may have known a little bit about him. We may have heard of one or two of his speeches in Parliament, but no more. But now the second major event occurs, which further transforms Cromwell and his life. And that is that war now breaks out in England between the King, King Charles I, and the English Parliament, essentially over who is in charge, who is actually governing the country. Is it the King or is it the Parliament? Okay, and so we got a very famous picture, a portrait here of Van Dyck. I remember the first time I showed it, somebody asked me, saying, I didn't realize he was triplets. And I go, no, he's not triplets. It's the same man, just from three different perspectives, okay? So there's only one King Charles. And King Charles found himself now in conflict with his Parliament. And clearly Cromwell, as a member of Parliament, sided with Parliament against the King. And in 1642, war breaks out. Okay, the English Civil War. And an extraordinary series of events takes place because it turns out that Cromwell, who has no military training whatsoever, nothing, has never lifted a sword in anger, has never fought anywhere, it turns out he is a natural for war. Okay, that he is a natural warrior, a natural fighter. And he very quickly shoots up the ranks of the English parliamentary army. His soldiers love him. And the reason they love him is that he takes the same risks that they do. Okay, he leads from the front. He's not an armchair general sitting at the back directing people. He leads right from the front. He takes the same hardships they do on campaign. He eats the same food that they do. He sees himself as one of them, even though he's their leader, and they are willing to follow him anywhere. And they become these kind of, if you like, God's warriors. They sing psalms on their way into battle. There's group prayer all the time. And Cromwell is very much to the forefront of that. And probably more than anything else, he's successful. And there's nothing that soldiers like more than a successful general. Because if you're successful, there's a greater chance you'll survive and you'll win. And so Cromwell now emerges as this extraordinarily successful soldier. Okay, so it's these two combined elements, the personal element of this connection with God and this rebirth, and then this extraordinary capacity for war that makes Cromwell into a national figure. And as the war goes on, Cromwell goes right to the very top until he ultimately is the leading general of the parliamentary army. Okay, and wonderful success on the battlefield, victory after victory after victory. Okay, so again, very important, very interesting life. But now, at the very end of the war, again, we've got an extraordinary turn of events because the Parliament beats the King. All right, the trouble is, he's still the King. All right, so if you turn your back on him, he's more likely to, come after you. And very quickly, the army, headed by Cromwell, decided they can't deal with this man. He's going to have to be got rid of. And so they put him on trial for war crimes. They blame him for the war which has taken place. Now, you have to understand, this is an extraordinary development. This is 150 years before the French Revolution. Okay, people think the French Revolution starts everything. It's when modern world begins. This is the first time that a king has been overthrown and monarchy overthrown. No, it happened in England 150 years earlier, in 1649, when King Charles is put on trial. Now, if you're going to put the king on trial, there's only one outcome. He has to be found guilty. Because if he's found innocent, the first thing he's going to do is put all you guys on trial for putting him on trial. So he's got to be found guilty, which he is. And now they have to take the momentous decision of executing him. Okay, and the members of Parliament gather to sign the death warrant. And there's this incredibly dramatic scene which takes place where they're all sitting around in the chamber with the death warrant and they've got to sign it. And the first man who's given it can't do it. He simply can't do it. His hand is shaking too much. The enormity of what's going on is just too much for him. And who is it? It's Cromwell, who stands up, walks over to him, takes his hand and signs the death warrant. And then he walks around the room with the warrant, getting everybody to sign it. And again, it's just an extraordinary illustration of his determination, his certainty over everything he does. Because he believes he's not acting as an individual, he's not acting selfishly, he's acting in the way that God wants. And so the death warrant is signed, Charles I is executed. And they set up the English Republic, which is the only time in the last millennia that England has been a republic, not a monarchy. Okay, from the execution of Charles I in 1649 until the restoration of his son Charles II 10 years later. Okay, and now today we've got Charles III, bizarrely. Okay, so here we are 350 years later, 450 years later. We've still got a monarchy in Britain, and we've got now the third Charles. Okay, but now we have the English Republic. Now the Republic is not popular. Charles was not a popular king, but killing him, that was a step too far for a lot of people. They said, no, that's against the natural order. It's against, we shouldn't be doing this, etc. It's not popular. So what does a government do when it's unpopular at home? And we've seen examples of this most recently as well. What do? You start a war overseas. Okay, that's a great way of distracting attention. Okay, and so now this is exactly what the English Republic does. And the greatest and the most hated enemy of English Protestants in the 17th century, I'm afraid to say, the Catholic Irish. Oh boy, did they hate the Catholic Irish, okay? Not only were the Catholic Irish heretics as far as they were concerned, because they followed the Antichrist in Rome, but they were barbaric savages, leading simplistic lives, no civilization. What they meant by civilization was they weren't English, okay? And they didn't live like the English lived, okay? And so therefore, this justified now dramatic intervention in Ireland. There had been a rebellion in Ireland while the English Civil War was going on, taking advantage of the distraction going on in England. And now the English decided to send an army over to Ireland to sort this out. And who better to send than your most successful general, Oliver Cromwell. So now, in 1649, Cromwell is tasked with forming a large invading army to come over to Ireland, crush the rebellion, and re-establish English Protestant rule in Ireland. Now, I think Freud would have or somebody with him, because this actually was a portrait of King Charles. And they airbrushed out the head and they put Cromwell in instead. Okay, now there's all sorts of things going on there that you could talk about, okay? But this portrait was commissioned as he was preparing for Ireland, the invasion of Ireland. So this was a formal portrait to sort of, acknowledge what he's now doing. And finally, in August 1649, he sails off to Ireland with a large, large army and a huge train of siege artillery. Okay, where does he land? Just down the road in Ringsend, okay? That's where he comes in, because Dublin at this time is the only part of Ireland that the English still control. The rest of the country has been lost, okay? But they still hold on to Dublin, so he lands in Ringsend, okay? Now, Cromwell only spends 9 months of his 60-year life in Ireland. That's all. It's very short, okay? But the impact he has during that 9 months is very extraordinary indeed. Okay, now if you look up, I'm not sure if you can make out the map here, but here's Dublin. Okay, and when they arrive in Dublin, they're looking for the enemy, and the closest enemy to hand is just north of Dublin in the town of Drogheda. And so after landing in Dublin within a few weeks, Cromwell heads north with his army to Drogheda, where he besieges and then sacks the town, killing most of the garrison, but in addition, large numbers of civilians as well. Okay, and he calls this, sort of, if you like, the retribution of God, the effusion of blood for those who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. He blames the Catholics for the rebellion, and now they're going to pay back. It's going to be payback. And Drogheda is where there is payback. Okay. A month later, he heads south, down to the southeast, and the next place he attacks is Wexford. And exactly the same thing happens at Wexford. The town is besieged, assaulted, and sacked. Garrison killed, and again, large numbers of civilians. Now, Cromwell argues at the time that this will so terrify the enemy that it'll bring the war to a quick conclusion. Okay? The idea is you hit them hard, quickly, dramatically, and that will demoralize them and they'll surrender, and that'll be the end of the war, and he can head back to England. Okay? It's very much like the argument the Americans made about dropping the atomic bombs at the end of the Second World War. They could have invaded the islands of Japan, but it would have led to large-scale deaths, etc., and a bloody campaign. So they drop a bomb in Hiroshima to basically terrify the Japanese into surrender. But the question that's always asked about the atomic bombs is, okay, Hiroshima, but why Nagasaki? What's the second one about? Okay, and likewise with Cromwell, maybe you could argue Drogheda was the lesson, but why the second lesson down in Wexford? And whatever the reasoning, it had the exact opposite impact that Cromwell had hoped. Because instead of terrifying the enemy into surrender, it made them believe that there was no point in surrendering because this man was determined to wipe them all out. And so this led to a war which was to last over 4 years. Now, Cromwell left after 9 months and went back to England, but the war carried on. All right, and during that 4-year period, the English themselves estimate that the population of Ireland fell by about 40%. A demographic disaster, far greater than the potato famine of the 1840s, as the civilian population were deliberately targeted in a genocidal campaign that was determined to wipe them out. In addition to death by warfare, infrastructure was destroyed, crops were destroyed, people were driven from their homes, dying from exposure, hunger, disease, and we have the last great outbreak of the Black Death around this time. So mid-17th century Ireland was not a happy place to be. Okay, and after 4 years of savage warfare, the Catholic Irish were finally defeated. Okay, now with that, tens of thousands of Catholic soldiers who had now surrendered were shipped off to France and Spain and the armies of Catholic Europe, the Wild Geese, where they served with distinction for many generations thereafter. Tens of thousands of vagrants, men, women, children, orphans, widows, were shipped up and brought off to the new sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in places like Barbados, where the harsh working conditions meant that few, if any, ever returned. Okay, and Ireland was now, as Cromwell called it, a clean slate. And what he meant by that was, it's time to start again. We finally got rid of this sort of awful, infestation of Irish Catholics. We can now start to rebuild, refashion Ireland in the way that we want. And the way that this was done was through the seizure of land. And the land was now redistributed to English Protestant settlers, creating what we now call the Protestant ascendancy. It's where we get these huge big landed estates that dominate Ireland from the 17th century through until the breaking up of those big estates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the legacy of this war lasts for over 250 years. And I would argue that it's that legacy that stays with us today. Ireland recovered remarkably quickly from the destruction of warfare. Within about 20 or 30 years, the population was on its way to recovering. The infrastructure had been rebuilt, but the country was not the same country as before. And you can see this most dramatically from a series of maps here. And this map here is landholding in 1641. And the blue, pink and grey, for reasons that I'm not going to go into. I did this project about 10 years ago with a colleague who did these maps for me. And when he showed me the maps, I went, they're great. They're based on 62,000 townlands. Each one is an individual townland dotted in there. It's extraordinarily detailed. I thought, that's great. But I said, why the colours? And he said, what colours? He said, I'm colourblind. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so anyway, we're stuck with the colours. I don't know, and someday I might get around to changing them, but at the moment that's what they are. And you can see the Catholics still own most of the land, except in Ulster, where the Ulster Plantation had taken place a few decades before Cromwell's arrival. But the Catholics are still the majority landholding throughout By 1670, you can see how that has changed very dramatically. Okay, and bar Connacht, Catholics have more or less disappeared from much of the rest of the country. These few bits of blue here are individuals who were friends of the newly restored king who got their lands back. For the most part, Catholics were cleared out of the other three provinces. It's where we get the very famous phrase, by the way, to hell or to Connacht. Okay, Cromwell never said that, by the way, which is sorry, but anyway, it's a good phrase. We'll allow it. I always thought it was a bit unfair on Connacht. Connacht's not that bad, actually. I don't know, to hell or to Connacht. It was just like, shitty, Mac. But anyway, so the Catholics were now pretty much restricted to land holding in Connacht, which gradually reduced as the 17th century went on. So by the end of the 17th century, Catholic landholders have disappeared almost completely. This is the largest single transfer of land anywhere in Europe during the early modern period. It's absolutely an extraordinary change that fundamentally alters the economic, social, political landscape of Ireland in a really basic, fundamental way. Okay, and this, I believe, is a legacy of Oliver Cromwell. Okay, because long after his death, this survived. Okay, and these great landed estates, as I said, for the most part, survived up into the 20th century. All right, now, Cromwell himself is back in England. Without a king, they're not quite sure how to run the country. And so eventually, in 1653, Cromwell takes over as Lord Protector, a military dictator running with the assistance and support of the army. And for the rest of his life, he serves as Lord Protector. Okay, he is effectively one man running the country, making all the decisions, which sounds remarkably like, what was it? The thing that he got rid of in the first place. But anyway, so much so that by 1657, people are saying, listen, this experiment isn't working. Cromwell, why don't you just become king? We know what a king is, we can kind of work it. And so a delegation from Parliament goes to Cromwell to say, will you please become King Oliver? Okay, which would have been one of the greatest ironies of all time had he finally ended up becoming king. And he would have, except that the army said no. They said, no, we fought against a king, we brought about the end of the monarchy, we're not supporting you as king. And without the army, Cromwell couldn't do it. So he very reluctantly turned down the offer. Now the following year, in 1658, at almost 60 years of age, which was a good age in the 17th century, okay, Cromwell died, and with that, the experiment in the English Republic came to an end. Okay, he had a son, Richard Cromwell, who took over briefly. He was known as Tumbledown Dick. He wasn't very effective, and very quickly, everybody decided we have to get a king back again. This just isn't going to work. Okay, and so the executed king's son, Charles II, comes back to the throne in 1660. As Charles II, and as I said, restores the monarchy, which has remained in place ever since. Now, he came back on condition that there would be no retribution against those who had fought against his father. Okay, so it wouldn't be widespread, persecutions and trials and executions, etc., of those who had fought for Parliament, with the exception of those who had signed the death warrant of King Charles I. Now, most of those had already died, or fled into exile, or gone into hiding. A handful of them they managed to get their hands on and they executed, but the person they really wanted was already dead, and that was Oliver Cromwell. So what do? They dug him up, okay? They dug him up, having buried him with a big state funeral in Westminster Abbey. They dug him up and they put him on trial, okay? They found him guilty and he was hung, drawn and quartered. Okay, and the body was thrown into a pauper's grave somewhere around Marble Arch in London, if you know London, sort of central London, except for the head, the skull, which was put on a spike on London Bridge. Okay, where it remained for the best part of 20 years, okay, until a supporter of Cromwell took it down. Okay, and there we have the skull of Oliver Cromwell. And he brought it to Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge, where it is to this day. Now, when I was a young postgraduate and I was starting my work on Cromwell and that whole period, I decided to go over to Sydney Sussex College just to see it. Thought it would be appropriate. And I walked into Sydney Sussex College and I said, look, is there any chance I can see the skull of Cromwell? And I could see the man porter behind the counter frantically pushing a button under the counter here. And next minute, about 5 or 6 security guards came into the area and I was escorted out of the college. I was going like, and apparently, an Irishman showing up to see Cromwell's skull is not appreciated, okay? You have to make prior arrangements and get an invite, and it's all very things, which I've never bothered to do, so I've never seen it. But if you're that way inclined, you can go and see Cromwell's skull. It is there. But what, with Cromwell's skull, medical historians recently, it's wonderful things they can do now with DNA and all sort of testing, etc. They did work on the skull to try and find out what killed Cromwell. I mean, he could have just died of old age, but he had died of a malarial type fever, something, you know, sort of that bound from waterborne, which they are pretty sure that he contracted during his 9 months in Ireland. So we got him in the end. We got him in the end. Not fast enough, but we did get him, all right? So that is ultimately what did kill him, okay? And as I said, that was the end of Cromwell's story. But what I just want to finish with is, I think it's very important, as much as we can kind of focus on an individual, and in a way, understandably so, because he's such an important, prominent individual in many ways, okay? We shouldn't put the ills of all that happened on the shoulders of one man. Cromwell was simply one of many prominent English leaders at this time, all of whom agreed with this policy, all of whom wanted to refashion Ireland, to change it, to deal with the Catholics in this way. He simply reflected English opinion at this time, okay? He wasn't something extraordinary. He wasn't an aberration. He wasn't somebody who, you know, sort of acted in a way that was completely contrary to all that had happened before or since. He was simply reflective of the contempt and hatred that most of English Protestants at this time held for the Catholic Irish. Okay, and so why he does remain, and it's funny because when you talk, particularly over in England, I've had many sort of conferences and debates and discussions, and people talk about Cromwell, and the English historians are always just a bit uncomfortable about Ireland, all right? They'll go on about his wonderful career in England, all he done, and then they go, oh yeah, and by the way, something happened over there, we're not really sure. And whatever he achieved in his life, and he made many extraordinary advances and had many extraordinary achievements in his life. But whatever he had done cannot be in any way balanced with his actions here in Ireland. That stain can never be wiped away. Because as I said, there is no doubt that his actions here in any way, and I've just written, there's a new world history of genocide that Cambridge University have produced, and they asked me to write a chapter on this period. This is genocide. There's no other two ways about it. By any criteria of the time, of the modern age today, what happened here was utterly inexcusable and abhorrent. And the man who was behind much of it and driving it was our friend, Oliver Cromwell. So does he deserve the sort of hatred and the negativity, etc., that he still generates in Ireland? But I'd have to say, yes, he does. Yes, he does. Okay. So with that, I'll leave it, and thank you very much for your time. And thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much. We'll start the question.
That was wonderful. That was wonderful. I just wanted to say, first of all, on Cromwell Road in Kimmage, where the Submarine Bar pub is, that's Cromwell Road. So there is a Cromwell
I
Road.
know. There's Cromwell Steps as well. I think down in Kilmainham, there's a place called Cromwell Steps as well. Is it top of James Street? Is it just there? And I know somewhere there's a whole series of steps down, isn't it? Cromwell Steps. So there are a few places that are sort of named for him here, which is a little bit unusual. You wouldn't expect it. You would have thought they'd be changed.
Of gym ladies, so I think we'll sort that out.
You can sort that out. It's about that time that place was renamed.
I wonder if Trump got a DNA test when he come back.
They'd be good bedfellows, all right, the pair of them. But anyway, like, yeah.
You said Cromwell landed in Dublin because it was. You said Cromwell landed in Dublin because it was the only safe place he could land. It was English. So, are you saying that the Pale? That was the Pale, was it? Up to Cromwell's time, did it never kind of really increase?
No. The Pale is something a bit different now. And the Pale has kind of gone at this stage as an area, identifiable area. But with the rebellion in the 1640s, the Catholic Irish took over most of the country. And one of the few places they didn't capture was the city of Dublin. So when Cromwell was coming in 1649, one of the few places he could safely land was the city of Dublin, because most of the rest of the country was now held by Catholic Irish who would have been hostile. So that's why he had to come to Dublin and, as I said, land down in Ringsend. No, I'll come.
Just a question. I was discussing Cromwell the other day with my nephew, and he was saying to me that they actually sent 2,000 young girls over to the Caribbean to mix with the blacks to get workers and that sort of thing. Is that true?
Well, no, I think what is correct in the sense that large numbers of Irish were sent over. We don't know exact numbers, but it's probably somewhere between 40 and 80,000, we don't know, went over mostly to Barbados, which was the main sugar plantation at the time. This was really prior to African slavery in a major way. And in fact, during the 1650s, African slavery had been closed off to England because they were at war with Spain and France and Portugal, etc. So they couldn't get their hands on African slaves. And so they used the Catholic Irish instead. Now, there was an amazing documentary on T.G. Cahir, I think a few years ago, about the Redlegs, which was this group in Barbados who are the descendants of these people who were sent over in the 17th century. And when they're talking, it was unbelievable. They had Kerry accents, Galway accents. I mean, it was extraordinary. What was even more extraordinary was after 350 years in the Caribbean, they were still as white as I am. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know, were they just staying out of the sun the whole bloody time or what they were doing? They hadn't actually mixed. And in Barbadian society today, they're among the poorest element in Barbadian society, that they had never really integrated. They never really had opportunities for advancement. And so they've stayed a very, very poor and deprived community in Barbados. So it's an extraordinary story, those people who went there. But as I said, few, if any of them, as far as we know, ever came back. It was just impossible.
Like 10 and 12-year-olds.
And it would have been right from kids, adults, everything. They were just shipped off in their tens of thousands. Okay. Sorry, was another? Sorry.
He was here for 9 months.
That's correct,
How
yeah.
many did he kill in Ireland? Because there were 10 million in the potato famine, and so there was 10 million people living in Ireland with the potato famine, yeah? At that
Well,
time.
8 million.
Okay, so
Yeah.
how many did he kill?
It's very difficult because one of the first things, we've no census around this time, so population figures are largely speculative. We don't know exactly. But as I said, the English estimate probably somewhere around 40% of the population was killed. The best estimate, the Irish population was probably around 1.5 million, 2 million, maybe. So 40% of that, you're looking at, 700,000-800,000. I mean, large numbers of people were killed. But as I said, I wouldn't be able to absolutely say that's exactly right, whatever. A lot of it is speculation because we just don't have the raw data that can tell us. But as I said, I tend to go with the English figures, which if anything would probably underestimate rather than overestimate. And they were saying somewhere in the region about 40%. So it's very, very significant numbers and a far higher percentage than those that died during the potato famine, which was the point I was trying to make around that, like, you know what I mean? So huge. I mean, absolutely. It's hard to even kind of imagine just the devastation at the time. It was absolutely extraordinary. Okay, and we get accounts where you have people riding through the countryside and they're saying there's nobody for about 30 miles, not a living soul, everything's deserted, everything's destroyed. I mean, the place is really leveled. It's very, very complete and it's very, very destructive. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just think it's fascinating when you hear about his younger life and the fact we had a breakdown and then he got religion. And then you look at things as they happen today and it seems to be a thing between these people organized, like all of a sudden they're talking to God and they're talking to everybody. And they've a sword in one hand and a religious book. And what I'm like to ask you is, you hear the phrase, history never repeats itself. I think it repeats itself a lot.
Well, no, the one that really annoys me is people say we must study history so we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. We're bloody repeating them all the fucking time. So I don't know where we get this idea that if we're studying history we're not going to do, because I agree with you, we do seem to repeat them all the time. But one historian had a lovely phrase which I thought was that Cromwell was always grappling with his conscience, but he always won. Okay, and so it was very convenient. It was very convenient that whatever he had to do, he somehow could always justify it. And the way he justified it was saying, well, God is speaking directly through me, so that must be what God wants. If you listen to religious fundamentalists today of whatever background, whether they're Muslim, they're Christian, they're Hindu, whatever. Religious fundamentalism is a very dangerous thing because it basically gives you the certainty to do whatever the hell you want, okay? And Cromwell is a perfect example of that, okay? And you see, one more thing just around that, which I found extraordinary. I edited 3 volumes of his letters and papers, which came out about 2 years ago. And in that, you got all these personal letters as well. He was a real family man. He had a very lovely relationship with his wife, a really strong relationship with his wife. He had a wonderful relationship with his children, wrote lovely letters to him. So this idea that somehow he's a monster or he's, no, it's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. In many ways, he was a very normal individual, living, a family life, living a lot of normal sort of life, but at the same time, this extraordinary sort of, determination and drive to achieve these things at whatever cost. And for the people of Ireland, it was a terrible cost. Okay, sorry, was there?
Professor, that was really captivating. It really brought it to life and hugely engaging. I'm hoping that you're going to give an answer that contradicts the question that I'm about to ask. There's a local historian in Drogheda, and I know this from having looked at an episode of Nationwide, and he's trying to, as it were, redeem Cromwell's reputation. Now, I have been indoctrinated, hardwired, and convinced, and I am now relaxed in my hatred of Cromwell. Is there any risk at all, and just relating to the last question, however nice a family man he may have been, but do you think there's any substance to the fact that he gave Drogheda a chance to surrender before he...
I think with relations, a guy called Tom Riley you're talking about who's written a number of books. It's just the same book with a different cover every time. But anyway, it's basically what he's just trying to say is Cromwell is an honourable enemy. And he keeps saying, he's very honourable and he does things and whatever, and he's trying to make the argument. I have no problem with making that argument. I mean, that's what history is about interpretation. It's not about right and wrong. It's not that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. We interpret history, in lots of ways, and we're looking at the evidence and we're making our own assumptions and interpretations based on that. So that's what history is about. In Riley's case, the problem is, as the great English Victorian historian, a guy called Firth said, there's a real danger of finding in history exactly what you go to history to find. And what he meant by that is if you're determined to show that Cromwell is a nice fella, you can find evidence in the past that somehow supports that. But in order to do that, you've got to ignore the mass of other evidence that's telling you something else. And that to me is the problem. Okay, that I don't mind somebody making the argument that, he's an honourable man, he was an honourable enemy, he wasn't as bad as people made out, but you need to support that evidentially. Otherwise, it's a pub conversation. Do you know what I mean? And that's not history. Okay, and unfortunately, Riley can't back any of this up because there's no evidence for it. Okay, and what I found interesting about it, however, is the response to it, because quite a number of people have jumped on to say, look, there he is, I told you he wasn't that bad, look, you're always complaining about the English, and look, he's not that bad because this guy's saying X, Y, and Z. So it's more the response to him that I found interesting rather than his work itself, which isn't great, unfortunately, do you know what I mean? But as I said, I think it's very important to make the point that obviously I'm giving my interpretation today. I've looked at the evidence, I've spent years looking at this. That's how I see it, okay? Others might see it differently, okay? And as I said, I would never stand up here and say, this is the only way you can see this is the only way to interpret this. No, it's not. But I think the evidence supports what I'm saying, and I think, if you're going to contradict that, well, show me the evidence, and then we can have a debate or discussion around it, okay? And I have to say, generally, when I've gone to the UK, and I have extensively over the years, we've some great debates, some very forceful, but it is always well received, because this isn't about attacking England. This isn't about attacking the English. This isn't about the old story again and again, etc. I'm saying, no, I've gone and looked at the evidence. This is what it's telling me, okay? And I'll stand and I'll defend it. And if you want to contradict that and debate, then I'm very, very happy to do so.
Apologies for being late today. You were in my calendar, but I just wanted to ask you, with your deep knowledge of Cromwell, I'm interested in Richard, the son, because I'll tell you why. I'm looking at America as well, and I'm sort of thinking, what could happen there too. But no, in relation to Richard, did he have much involvement with Ireland himself, or could you just give us...
Richard had none. I mean, it's quite interesting. Richard, that's Cromwell's eldest son, who succeeds him as Lord Protector, but it falls apart within a matter of months. He just isn't of the same calibre. He doesn't have that same drive, determination, ability, etc. that his father had. But funnily enough, when the king is restored, he doesn't touch Richard. Richard lives out the rest of his life in England and doesn't die till 1712, 52 years later. He just leaves him to live. He lives an obscure life on a farm, which is probably exactly what the father would have done had circumstances not worked out as they did. Okay, but I always thought it was quite interesting. You would have thought that having got back in, the king would be targeting the Cromwell family and he'd be looking to get them, whatever. He didn't, actually. He left them, and Richard was just left to live out his life, as they say, in obscurity on a farm. The younger son, Henry Cromwell, now he was a man of ability, and he was in Ireland, and he was Cromwell's man in Ireland for the second half of the 1650s. Now, if Henry had taken over on the death of the father, then things might have turned out a bit differently, all right? Because he was very capable, he was a very committed and respected soldier, and he may well have been able to carry on the Republican agenda, etc. But, Cromwell, again, acting like a king, gave it to the eldest son, okay? Not to the most capable, not to the one who might have actually think he gave it to the eldest son, probably knowing full well that the son simply wasn't able, all right? But it's interesting, as I said, the way that the family worked out, and as it happened, it was actually the younger son who really was the one who probably should have taken over. I saw there's some lovely letters from the dad to Richard. Well, Richard was still a young man, and he's always giving out to him, poor old Richard, because I think he's a great disappointment to the father, and he's always giving out to him and saying he's not doing this and he's not doing that and he's not succeeding in this. And, it's just a sort of an unfortunate kind of series of letters and the relationship between them. But the one thing that really grabbed my attention was Cromwell wrote, this is about 1646 or 1647, he wrote to Richard, he said, "Richard, the one thing you have to do, because all great and important men do it, and that is to study history." And I thought, yeah, he knows what he's talking about. Absolutely, all the best of us, we all study history. And I think Cromwell himself was very conscious of the past and what his legacy might be, etc., even during his life. Okay, because I think he realized how momentous this time was and how important this was in the histories, of England, Scotland, Ireland, etc. This really was an extraordinary time. And I find it, the sort of proof of that is, as I said, here we are almost 400 years later, and we can still talk about this, and people still kind of resonates with them. They still kind of understand the importance of this and significance of this, okay? Whereas other people in the past might have been forgotten about. Not this man, not this man. And in a way, we can't afford to forget about him. He's a very, very important character. We probably time one very quick, and then I'm going to have to run. Sorry.
Just a statement. Whatever he did, whether he must have spent time either in Ringsend, in Wexford, or Drogheda, because there's a family of Cromwells in
No way! They're here! Jeez, I left them behind, did he? Oh, God. All right. Unfortunately, we'll allow them, because I don't think that's anything to do with that family, like, you know what I mean? So, but yeah, I've come across the odd Cromwell, around Ireland as well. It's not that unusual a name at the time, And in fact, if anybody's seen the wonderful Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall and all those, it talks about another Cromwell 100 years earlier, Thomas Cromwell. Completely different man, completely different family. But, there's another important Cromwell. So, the name's not that unusual, and you do actually get it around. Now, unfortunately, guys, I'm going to have to go because I have to run for a train. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much indeed.